I'm really delighted you are all here. I'm Tricia Rose. I'm the director for the Center of the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. And we worked very closely with the Taubman Center and the Watson Institute to make this event happen. We're very excited to collaborate. We have Rick Locke here, who's the director for Watson, and Jim Morone, the new director for the Taubman Center, who are both also on the panel. In fact, Rick Locke is going to be our moderator and also sort of timekeeper. We are really dedicated to 10 minutes each so that we have a lot of time for conversation. And that's even more important given how many of you are here. So this is just a general welcome, and thank you so very much for coming. Although it's not a happy conversation, the only way to get to a good place in this kind of a situation is to have a meaningful conversation. So showing up is really the beginning. So thank you very much, and now please join me in welcoming Rick Locke for opening comments.
Thank you very much, Tricia, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people here this evening to talk about a set of disturbing but also extremely important issues. Speaking for the Watson Institute, I want to say that it's a real honor as well as a pleasure for us to collaborate with the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity on this session, but we also hope many more coming forward in the year. Let me just tell you a little bit about the different panelists and then about the ground rules for tonight's session. We have 5 panelists from different disciplines and different institutions speaking tonight. Each of them will speak for no more than 10 minutes so that we can sort of open it up for questions, discussion, et cetera. In the order that they're sitting closest to me is our first speaker, Professor Jim Morone, who is a professor of political science and the director of the Taubman Center here at Brown. I can give a longer bio for each person, but you can go on the website if you want and look at it. Our second speaker is Professor Anthony Bogues. Is a professor of Africana Studies and also the director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Seated next to him is Professor Marcia Chatelain, who is an assistant professor of history at Georgetown University. And then in between Marcia and Tricia is Stefano Bloch, who is a Mellon Post-Doctoral Fellow here at Brown in both the Urban Studies Department and the Cogut Center for Humanities. And finally, we have our very own Professor Tricia Rose, who is a professor of Africana Studies and also the director of the study of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. The goal of tonight's teach-in is to take the events that occurred literally a month ago in a small city on the outskirts of St. Louis that led to all sorts of social disruption and all sorts of real soul-searching of not just issues like militarization of police and municipal finances and things like that, but also on, once again, this core issue of American politics, which is race and ethnicity and the role that it plays in our past politics as well as in our current and future situation. And what we want to do is have a series of people who have real expertise in different dimensions of this set of issues to sort of offer their thoughts. None of them are going to be super comprehensive. They're not going to tell you everything you need to know about this very complex issue. They're just going to give a perspective as a way of stimulating an honest conversation amongst us all here in the room. As each one of them speaks, as I said, no more than 10 minutes, then we want to really open it up for question and discussion, et cetera, and you'll see that there are microphones on both sides in these 2 aisles, so you can ask your questions. Please, when you do ask your questions, be sure to identify yourself. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Jim Morone.
Thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture. Just pull back a little bit, and then you'll get to the people who really know something. So let me start with 2 snapshots. It's 1963, and the United States, most people think, is finally confronting its racial dilemma. There is, if you go back and look at the public opinion polls, real optimism in the summer of 1963. 80% of Americans think we're on the right track, that we're finally confronting America's original sin. Fast forward to 1968, and that moment of optimism is long gone, completely gone. The electoral results, if you begin to look at them, I'll get to Ferguson, in 1968, shows a kind of remarkable fact. White people stopped voting for Democrats because the Democratic Party was seen as a party sympathetic to race. If you look at the Electoral College turnout, Electoral College result between 1968 and 1992, the Democrats averaged 71 electoral votes. As you know, it takes 270, 71 electoral votes. Just weren't voting for them. So the great question is, what happened to American politics? And the answer is that for a time, the issue of race became so fraught that beginning in 1968, white people weren't going to vote for the Democratic Party. And then things began to change. If you look at more recent elections, starting in 1992, Democrats go 4-1-1. 4 wins, 1 loss, 1 tie. Things transform themselves, but in a way that's difficult for a lot of Americans to understand. What changes? What transforms itself? Well, it's kind of simple. If you look at the electorate, the people who say, I'm voting for Republicans, stays absolutely the same. It's 88% of the Republican vote is white. But the number of people who are voting who are not white starts to go up, 2% every year. And that creates a kind of tension in the American electorate, in the American political regime, in America itself. And the reason I want to get into all this is the picture you've all seen from Ferguson. That military force, those people with that incredible military hardware, confronting black demonstrators. What I'm saying is that the politics, the status of black and white has become really difficult, really fraught in the United States. It's reflected in our electoral politics, and it's reflected in the way we are confronting the changing American, not just electorate, but the changing American population. Last year is the first year since sometime in the 1600s that most people born in the United States, most babies born in the United States, were born to parents who don't identify themselves as white. The American population is changing rapidly, changing dramatically. And that leaves the majority something to think about. And what they think about is what's happening to this country, to our country. What we know about how people think about race in America got beautifully articulated by Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville said that race is most fraught, not in the South where there's slavery, he's writing this in 1835, but in the North where there's no slavery. And it's worst when slavery never existed. Frederick Douglass found the same thing. Frederick Douglass talks about being hired out as a slave to help build a ship. And the white workers were happy to have him. They worked with him, no problem. And then some black freemen came along, and the white workers threw down their tools and left. They were perfectly happy working next to a slave. They were not happy working next to free black men. Tocqueville's line on it is status anxiety. The idea that African Americans are going to be equal to whites creates a tremendous status anxiety. It's what Frederick Douglass understood and felt. And it's that runs under an awful lot of the anxieties that face the United States. Not everybody, of course, but an awful lot of Americans have to confront the idea that in the next 25 to 30 to 35 years, the majority of people, current trends continuing, will identify themselves as not white. And that's difficult. Now, we've been here before. In the great immigrations of the 19th century, we had the same issue, and there was a solution. Go to the immigrants and say, hey, wait a minute, you're one of us, you're white. And the immigrants said, oh yeah, we're white. We're not like those people, we're white. And so you bring new populations out of the racial category and into whiteness. One problem. Today's generation of immigrants are essentially saying, we don't want to play that game. We're not going to do that anymore. Asians, you're the model minority. No, we don't want to play that game. So if that doesn't work, what happens to a country trying to hang on to this kind of statuses, the kind of regime, the kind of politics, the kind of culture that the country has long had? Well, a second possibility is to begin to say, you people are misbehaving and have to be controlled. One way of controlling is to take away the vote. And that is a huge battle, as you know, in American politics today. A second way to assert controls is to say the misbehavior is crime. We're going to respond to crime by militarizing and confronting. When I try to understand those really horrific images of an occupying army facing down protesters, what I see, what I kind of feel, is this notion of we're going to protect, we're going to somehow reassert an America, we're going to reassert a status that is fading away from us. Now, this sounds pretty dire, but it's kind of optimistic if you just think how the United States is changing. It's changing in dramatic ways. But the transition from the current America to the future America, the transition from a country that was largely white to a country in which a majority of people say, I don't identify as white, is a fraught and scary transition. And that's to suggest that as race politics, as we confront and think and shape our racial politics, we're apt to be in for a very bumpy ride, a very bumpy kind of couple of decades. I see a future, if things continue the way they are, that's really pretty optimistic. Imagine how everything has to change if we're in a country, the majority of whom say, you know what, I'm not really into this racial thing. I don't identify as a white person. It's a complete, everything you know has to be rethought. But before we get there, we see the kinds of racialized politics that explode, and they explode over and over again. And what we're seeing in Ferguson, Missouri, is the United States, I think, looking in the mirror and confronting this great change, this change about which I'd be very optimistic, this change about which many people are very frightened. Great change brings great anxieties, brings great status anxieties for an awful lot of people. And if that's true, we're going to see lots of controversy, lots of trouble, lots of explosions. But I actually believe that at the end of all that, great change, and change perhaps to a much better country, a much better place between here and there, lots to talk about, lots to worry about. And of course, that's what this day is about. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Tony Bogues.
Thank you all very much. Thank the organizers for inviting me to do this. This is a very important teaching because the August events in Ferguson, Missouri, represents a flashpoint. I'm not an expert. I speak as a citizen of this country who now lives here. Flashpoints illuminate things that officially and typically are opaque or hidden. At flashpoints, things explode into full view. Protest events have a life of their own life and their own bodies, and indeed, their own logic. There is a kind of ebb and flow to protests, a kind of rhythm that they have. And what flashpoints do is, while illuminating these things, sometimes also ebb and flow, giving us a different kind of logic, illuminating things that we need to think about. So what I want to do in my brief remarks is to address what I consider the points of illumination, which emerge in the flashpoints of Ferguson. The event, as we know, lasted from August the 14th, the shooting of Michael Brown, right up until, in full force, August the 25th. Fully 2 weeks of what one may consider mass action. So what is the first illumination? The first illumination is that communities are not quiescent, that things fester and then explode. And the question that we have to ask are, what are the triggers that cause the explosion? Of course, we are aware of some of these triggers. Racism in a so-called post-racial society. But we know the reality of racism in a so-called post-racial society. Education for ordinary black people and black men and women. Questions or not questions, issues of incarceration for black men, and the way in which the police treat black men, driving while black, walking while black. But law enforcement have always been at the tip, have always been, if you wish, at the edge of the way in which racism operates. Because racism is not just about creating certain conditions of life for those who are racially dominated. Racism is also about creating order. And to create order, you need law enforcement. And therefore, what happens in the creation of order in this kind of society is that black folks, and particularly black men, are considered animals. Listen to one police officer caught on the CNN tape when he was faced with a black male demonstrator. This is what he says: "Bring it on, you effing animal." Now, we don't need to spend time on all of this. We know this, but importantly, the black community knows and feels it. Ask the mother who says to her son, "Know who they please," begs him as he goes out at 10 o'clock at night to meet his friends. Ask the mother who says to her son, "Please wear your belt around your waist." Ask the mother who cannot sleep until her black son comes home safely. So those of us in the black community not only knows, but feels this. And if you ask me to think about the Ray Kelly thing a couple of months ago on this campus, it was also about those who think they know and those who feel and therefore experience certain things and then react to those feelings in a certain way. Because flashpoints are about everyday experiences, which then reach a boiling point to explode, they illuminate. And in Ferguson, the question of illumination was really illumination for whom in relationship to questions of race or to the business of racism. Black community already know this, as I said, the mother, because there are parallel lives in this country in which invisibility for black people is the order of the day. It is not, of course, the invisibility of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, but there's a certain kind of invisibility of black life, which is now covered up with discourses around the post-racial movement and a visibility of the black middle class. The second illumination. The second illumination has to do with the militarization of the police. Since 9/11, we now know that there have been surplus weapons of war from the Pentagon, which have been sold to various state polices in this country. Suddenly, the streets of Ferguson look like a war zone. And all this has been happening quietly, so-called quietly, in the background. But it's been brought on by two things. Firstly, the consistent war on drugs that began in the 1980s, if not before, and the now new drive, recent drive, to patrol the borders. December 7th, 2009, Homeland Security says in a series of documents that they now need to use drones in Mexico, in Canada, and in part of the Caribbean. One spokesperson said, we now need to have the leading edge of technology to secure the borders, and to secure them from immigrants. The new act, the new Immigration and Border Security and Economic Act of Modernization Act of 2013 distributes $6.5 million to border security and to high-tech surveillance and to weaponry. Therefore, the militarization of the police is part of a general plan about a certain kind of national security, which is supposed to be about borders, but it is also about how to deal with so-called disposable bodies, disposable populations created by racism and by a set of economic orders in this country. The National Security Document of the United States of last year talks about, for the first time, not just external security, but internal security, internal threats. These threats are supposed to be, in quotation marks, terrorists. But it is also about securing borders and also making sure that disposable populations who do not submit to the order are dealt with in this national security state. The third illumination. The third illumination is the imperial national security state. We do not connect dots typically, but illuminations and flashpoints from illuminations allow us to connect dots, allow us not to see each episode as independent from the general picture. Not just a big picture, but a general concrete picture of what life really like is that for vast majority of people. The national security state that I'm calling here is one that we know is about economic surveillance. Ed Snowden's revelations have showed us that. But there's also the militarization of the local state authorities and surveillances in the body, in the borders. So what we have is a complex new formation of states in which questions of surveillance and questions of militarization, drawing from the ways in which the imperial state acts abroad are now coming home to roost. In such a context, racism operates. And in our context, it is almost like a paradox that under a black president, racism seems to be on the increase. But perhaps to understand this so-called paradox is to return to the foundation of the American Republic, the American democracy, to understand that American democracy and American racism were born together. Du Bois made the point very clearly that in fact you can't think about questions of democracy, Du Bois says, and black reconstruction without not thinking about the business and the matter of the black worker and of slavery. What Ferguson illuminated was that this particular historical fact demonstrated by or announced by Du Bois is very much alive, that it continues to shape our society, but it shapes it within a new context. It shapes it within the context of a national security state. And that therefore we begin to think about racism. It is not just the horrors of Ferguson. It is not just the beating of a young man. It is not just the murder, if you wish, and I will want to call it that. But it is also, as Martin Luther King made very, very clear to us, that you cannot think about race without thinking about militarism, without thinking about war. And what is the connection and the profound connections between all three? Perhaps we are not in a, and not perhaps, we are not in a post-racial moment. But we are in a particular moment where we need to understand the way in which drones, the way in which border securities, the way in which surveillance, and the way in which race and order, the way in which the criminal justice system operates, the way in which all these things come together to create a certain kind of way of life in this country. To think, therefore, about Ferguson is to think about illuminations, is to think about some of the questions about militarization, It's to think about how race operates in a so-called post-racial moment. It's to understand that communities are not going to be quiescent, but it is also to understand that we are living in a national security state that we need to grapple with. And in that national security state, the business of order is important. And that historically in this country, order has meant treating black people in a certain disposable way. Those are the fundamental issues which face us. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. Thank you very much, Tony. Our next speaker is Professor Marcia Chatelain.
Or should I turn on this microphone as well? This is good? Okay, great. It's wonderful to come to Brown. When I was a graduate student, I thought I would never leave, so coming back feels very good. I came to Brown after completing my undergraduate degree at the University of Missouri, and coming to the East Coast, I might as well have gone to Mars for graduate school. The culture here was so different than what I was used to in the Midwest, and being at Brown was, I think, the continuation of a political education that started at the University of Missouri, and I wanted to talk a little bit about those two educational processes in order to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done around Ferguson and the hashtag Ferguson syllabus, which is on Twitter, and it's an exciting hashtag. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience in the state of Missouri as an African-American student who started college in the summer of 1997. I was part of a group of students at a university that enrolled at the time about 20,000 people. My incoming freshman class or first year class was about 5,000 students. And at the University of Missouri, there had been a long pattern of there being less than 100 African-American students in that incoming class. And that experience was an illumination for me when I thought about what the purposes of a state institution were. And it's to serve the people of the state whose taxes support that institution. And that was at the back of my mind when I saw the unrest in Ferguson unfold. I thought about all the people in Ferguson who had paid for me to go to college and to get this exceptional education and that allowed me the pathway to Brown, and how unusual my narrative was and the narrative of many of the students who went to schools with Michael Brown. And that shaped a lot of, I think, some of my emotional attachment besides the tragedy of what happened. And when I think about Ferguson, and I think about the student activism that I discovered at Missouri, I think about my time at Brown as a political education of a different sort. It's joining these two ideas together. So when all of these things were unfolding, I was on Twitter, which I spend way too much time on. And I had this sick feeling about the tone that Ferguson was setting for the incoming students that I would teach at Georgetown. I thought, what a way to shape the beginning of this massive change in their life of going away to college. And then I started getting really irritated, and this is usually what starts me on something. I remember a few years ago, I was talking to a group of professors of color. And I asked them, I said, how did you talk about the Trayvon Martin case with your students? And one of them replied, it happened over the summer, so I didn't have to. That annoyed me so much. And it annoyed me because we were having a conversation about the very real consequences for our students on campuses with police harassment, with harassment in public spaces. And here they were saying, well, of course I didn't talk about it. And then someone said, well, I teach the 19th century, so I had nothing to say about it. It really annoyed me. And so when I was tweeting obsessively while I was watching cable news obsessively, I thought to myself, can I use Twitter, which connects me to other professors, so it's not a very exciting Twitter feed, to talk to them and try to convince them to devote the first day of classes to talking meaningfully about Ferguson. And it was kind of like a little bit of a shame strategy, like, so how are you going to talk about Ferguson? And I didn't ask if, but just how. And part of the response was, oh, you know, I'd like to do that. I just don't know what to do. And this is the second thing that irritates me. It's a kind of racial innocence where I can't believe this happened. I'm really upset, so I'm going to engage not at all with this. And so I figured that I could shame and like upset more people by just telling them what to do. And so that's what started Ferguson syllabus. This is what my years of activism has taught me, that public shaming is usually your first strategy, and then you bring in all the loving, beloved community stuff. That's like step 2. But seriously, I started to say, okay, if you really are at a loss, and a lot of us were at a loss because what was happening was so demoralizing, it was so soul-crushing, and it was so present, right, because of the constant news coverage, then I'll give you some suggestions. And so I just started this hashtag, Ferguson syllabus. And the first goal was to get colleges and universities to commit to this. And as more people shared it, I was contacted by high school teachers and saying, look, I work in an environment where no one wants to talk about race, no one wants to talk about conflict, but I know there's something to talk about. And that's when my time at Brown kind of kicked in. The interdisciplinary training that I received in the American Civilization Now Studies program, I felt like this is what was happening, right? That the opportunity I had to become a scholar, not just as a historian, but also among sociologists, among people in lit. I was watching digital humanities take off at Brown a decade ago. Those experiences kind of all came together in this opportunity to have a conversation across disciplines, but more importantly, to set the responsibility at the feet of all people. One of the things that also gets me going is this idea that it is a responsibility only of scholars of color or people in the humanities or people who talk about that race stuff to engage all the race problems. This has never been helpful because we're exhausted. We do this all the time. So if I tell you that you have a place in which to have this conversation, you start to rethink the way you teach. And it's the most amazing thing that I never imagined would take off the way it did, but I really had thoughtful people who say, listen, you know, I'm in engineering. I don't really know how to talk about this. And I said, okay, well, we can talk about weaponry. We can talk about the moral questions about what kind of weapons we use against civilians. What a wonderful way to have students in your science classes enter this conversation from a different perspective. You know, we had people who say, you know, I teach in music, what's there to talk about? Why don't you talk about protest songs? Talk about the music that was retweeted out as a result of this, right? And so what this required was a sense of community, that everyone knew that we were all trying to work this out in our position as educators. And amazing things have happened as a result. The other thing that I just want to kind of say about this process is that what I found really just quite beautiful is the way that there is no ownership, right? Like, I started a hashtag. I didn't invent the internet. I'm not in charge of anything. I don't have the clipboard. And that's like the point, right? That this is an opportunity for people to provide what they have to offer and expand on those skills. Even though we do teaching in community, when you're a teacher, sometimes it's really isolating. I rarely talk to my colleagues about what I'm teaching, probably for my best interest, but I don't talk to people about what I'm doing in the classroom, right? It's second nature. And here was an opportunity for people at different types of institutions with different types of demographics who are working with different issues to really commit to a singular focus. And so I've talked to teachers from a lot of places who have decided to redesign their syllabi and say, you know what, this semester Ferguson is front and center. And for people who were a little more skittish and said, you know, I didn't think I was able to do this, and now I know I can just have a conversation with my students about conflict, about how to build community, how to take responsibility when you make a huge mistake, right? These are these basic ideas that we now see as the lens for Ferguson. And so I'm gonna leave you with so everyone was like, well, what did you do the first day, right? They were trying to see if I actually did it. And I was like, yeah, I did it. So the first thing, in my African American women's history class, we talked about the invisibility of women in discourses about police brutality. And so we drew a line from Ida B. Wells and her train car challenges to Joanne Little in North Carolina in the 1970s to Renisha McBride. And then we had a conversation, and this always gets students, but students at Brown I know always have the answer, so don't answer the question. It's a rhetorical process. I said, if there was a major racial conflict in your town, what woman would come? What woman is at the head of a national civil rights organization? What women would be brought in? And everyone gets quiet. And I said, well, do you think that's a little bizarre? And they're like, oh, I guess Oprah would come in, right? And we have this kind of, which is like kind of right, but then we talk about why that's a problem, right? So it's a conversation that helps us, right, break free from the patterns of the regular cast of characters. The second class I teach is a first-year seminar. For some of the students, it's the very first class they take in college, and I want to talk to them about racial conflict. So it's about African-American food culture. And I said, okay, so this class is about food culture, but it's also about who makes our food and what's the purpose of food. And so we talked about the fact that in Ferguson, Missouri, 76% of households qualified for free lunch, right, based on the federal standards. And we talked about the fact that the school opening was delayed, so kids did not get free lunch. What are the consequences of that? And what does it say about this town that this many people have access to free lunch? I tricked the students, and now we're talking about poverty and race and poverty in suburbs, right, and what that looks like. And what does it mean when Ferguson initially was called a middle-class suburb, and then we expose the rates of poverty in a town that might look like any other place in America. And so all this requires is a little bit of goodwill, a Twitter account, and a willingness to have conversations from a place of moving away from the kind of conversation that says, well, I'm not an expert on race, so I say nothing, instead of saying, I'm an expert in this, and this is how race is constantly shaping what I'm doing. So I'm very excited. If you want to learn more, hashtag Ferguson syllabus. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. That was really terrific. Our next speaker is Dr. Stefano Bloch.
Hello. So I'm living in and in many ways participating in the construction of a ganghood in Los Angeles during the 1990s, when we all walked down the street wearing our Raiders jerseys, Dickies pants, Nike Cortezes, we felt confident and prepared for battle, that's literally and metaphorically speaking. The seemingly superficial elements of style matters to how people act, perceive others, and are perceived by others. Style is particularly important to gang identity and performance, as I knew well then and now. But what is a gang? According to the sociologist Frederick Thrasher, who is considered the expert on this topic from his article in 1922, gangs are made up of individuals who, although unique, at times act collectively or in concert, are expressive of their allegiance to a group and its declared identity. A gang moves through space as a unit until it meets some hostile element. And a gang is defined by mechanisms of interaction in social situations, whether those actions are criminal or not. So now, according to the definition used by the Department of Justice, as well as the State Assembly in Rhode Island that recently voted to add 10 years to prison sentences for individuals convicted of a felony that was committed in connection to gang activity or identity, a gang is this: an organization, association, or group of 3 or more persons, whether formal or informal, having as one of its activities the commission of criminal or simply delinquent acts, and having an identifiable name or common identifiable signs, colors, or symbols. So I don't know if Michael Brown was in a gang or not, but I do know that a gang for whom style, expression, and allegiance matters is in fact operating in Ferguson, and that gang is the Ferguson Police Department. Now, what I'm going to go into now is that this isn't necessarily a major critique, defense, or demonization of a gang in this case. This is an understanding of the way in which a gang is performed by the Ferguson Police Department, much in the way gangs were performed by me and my friends in 1990s Los Angeles, one having more dire consequences than the other, I will argue. So how does this understanding of a gang apply to the police? Legally speaking, if a standing army relying on military tactics and employing military equipment against a non-violent civilian population is in fact illegal according to the US Constitution as well as international law, then the Ferguson police, by this definition, are in fact an illicit gang. But I can't make this legal case here, and I don't want to make this legal case here, although some have and continue to make this case, especially as some law enforcement groups, such as the now disbanded CRASH, or Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums unit of the Los Angeles Police Department, have been described by federal prosecutors as, in fact, gangs. Instead, I'd like to focus on the deeply superficial aspects of police departments performing as gangs in terms of their members' expressive style and fashion choices. SWAT, which is Special Weapons and Tactics units, have been in operation since the 1960s. These are heavily armed and armored groups that, according to journalist Radley Balco, make violent entry into private homes in the United States over 100 times per day. And overwhelmingly for non-violent, what are called consensual crimes. That is, public order crimes in which participants consensually participate and for which there is no immediate or direct harm being done to potential victims. When encountering the public, members of SWAT and other tactical law enforcement units rely on military hardware that ranges from combat-grade semi-automatic high-powered weapons and camouflage clothing to full body armor and armored attack vehicles, to, increasingly, airborne drones and other technologically advanced and legally ambiguous devices. Over the last 2 decades, the military and State Department have donated millions and millions of dollars worth of surplus equipment to municipal law enforcement agencies that apply under the guise of thwarting terrorism, stopping drug cartels, and disbanding organized criminal syndicates, and increasingly so to stop illegal immigration. And these are hardly accurate descriptions for what is occurring in Ferguson, Missouri. And along with this equipment come military advisors and ex-military trainers educating local civilian police officers in combat tactics. In addition to this, police in cities and towns across the country drive around in souped-up vehicles and equip themselves on a daily basis with intimidating military-style black jumpsuits, shin guards, bulletproof vests, reflective glasses, as well as the standard issue of high-powered handguns and, I'm going to do air quotes, less than lethal munitions. Combined with military-style haircuts and battlefield-learned demeanor and language, these deeply superficial fashion and style choices have real consequences. Militarized police need an enemy worthy of the equipment. When groups of mostly men, and mostly white men who do not live in the communities they police, get dressed up in this way, the objective actions of community members, who in this case and most cases are mostly black, need not actually or realistically be violent in order to incite a violent response by these well-dressed police officers. Instead, this enemy needs simply exist and be perceived by militarized police as appearing to be potentially violent. Regardless of the action taking place on the street during a protest, the gear and the technology come to define the terms of the encounter. Police are living up to their gadgets, which they're excited to finally be using. They're often not reacting to any evident threat that could justify the use of a Humvee or MP5, which is a German-designed Heckler & Koch 9mm submachine gun that is issued to police forces, some police forces, of which there are only 4 members because they're in very small rural towns, and these guns being pointed at crowds of men, women, and children with their hands raised in defiant, though very peaceful protest. So young people especially are told that the way they dress and present themselves has an effect on how people will treat them. We've all heard that ourselves. After the killing of Trayvon Martin by a vigilante in Florida, the hoodie sweatshirt was placed in the shop window of public opinion. Commentators made the argument, and ultimately a jury agreed actually, that the killing was justified because the victim had precipitated the violence. And in criminology, this is called victim-precipitated homicide. You had it coming, you were asking for it, I felt threatened, therefore. Which changes it from a homicide, which is a legal distinction, to a killing, for which there is no prison sentence in most cases. The fact that Trayvon Martin was seen as precipitating the violence was based on how he was dressed and how he carried himself. That was enough. So when the police show up to a peaceful protest in riot gear and brandishing military-grade weaponry and driving armored attack vehicles, I tend to agree that fashion and style do in fact matter and have dire consequences for peace and justice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And our last panelist is Tricia Rose.
Well, I want to thank all my colleagues here. I thought it would be cool to go last, but now everyone has said 90% of all the most cool things, so I'm going to work with the 10% rule and see what I can come up with. I really appreciate what everyone has said here, because there's a lot that we need to understand about how this incident in Ferguson needs to be framed and reframed to help us make sense of it. What I want to focus on in my 10 minutes is the rather significant way in which both the media and investigative journalists and general public conversation and political figures have framed this incident in a way that I would argue render it impossible to understand. That the public framing of what happened has been turned into a very microscopic context. That is to say, what did this one policeman do? What was his intent? What was his purpose? What was his condition? What does this young man, Michael Brown, mean? What was he up to? What kind of person was he? What kind of family does he come from? All of those kinds of, on both sides of that seemingly impossible divide. This micro focus absolutely undermines our ability to understand why Ferguson and what happened there was more than just a one-off example of an individual in conflict with a law enforcement representative. At any moment, there are going to be conflicts that young people might have with any number of police officers around the world. It's, as you know, Stefano pointed out, there are structural ways in which that happens. But that does not automatically mean that there's one individual who's done something wrong and the other one has done something right. There's conflict. It happens. What makes thousands of people stand up, not one night, not 2 nights, not 3 nights, but 2 solid weeks in the face of elevated submachine guns, which those who've been trained say you never, even in the theater of war, carry it in the face of individuals? What constitutes the context for the level of outrage, the crying, the sobbing, the elderly, the young people, the children, the 30-year-olds, the 40-year-olds, not just the teenagers, but everyone? What provoked that kind of outrage? What made Ferguson in this moment and the shooting of this young man a tipping point? That is the central journalistic mainstream media question that has gone completely unaddressed, and that allows us, not necessarily the matter of side taking, but it allows us to understand the context. And that context takes it out of the individual circumstances of this one moment on this one day and helps us make not only enormous sense of everyone's investment in challenging not just the police but the entire structure of authority and policy in the town, but why thousands of people would come from around not just to be vultures but come to stand in support because they themselves find these kinds of conditions everywhere else. So this reframing requires that we understand what is going on in what has been called the post-civil rights era. As my colleague, Professor Bogues, called it, quote-unquote, post-race. But I want to bring us back just a little bit before that fabulous, charming iteration came into existence. And I want to talk a bit about the struggle and the crisis of the last 40 years, what people like to call the era after legalized racial segregation and subordination and a lack of legal status was overturned. The point at which we legally make the claim as a nation that it is unlawful and illegal to structurally discriminate against black people is the moment in which we now transform our practices from explicit racialized laws to laws that produce obvious racial results, but that have no racial name in the beginning. So what you have is a race-neutral seeming policy that produces deeply racialized outcomes. Sociologists of a variety of types would call this structural racism. It doesn't have the language of, say, 1940s racism or bigotry or personal attitudes. You can, in fact, have a lot of friends of color and benefit dramatically from structural racism, right? I mean, sorry. That's how it goes. Didn't know I was going to be able to find a joke in this one today. This wasn't feeling funny when I was thinking about it. So what happens under structural racism is that we have a new set of circumstances that happen seemingly invisibly, right? So we can't explain the rage of the community there because it looks crazy, right? It looks, what are they so worked up about? We have laws that protect people. This is one bad guy. If we can just get him in jail or get him off the force or put him on admin leave or do some kind of crazy thing for this one, we'll be cool. Because all the laws are set up, and we don't know very many people who harbor explicit racialized hatred attitudes, right? This is the world in which we have created, as Bonilla Silva might call it, the sociologist from Duke, racism without racists, right? So we have no more racists, but we have enormous amounts of structural racism. So now how does this happen? It happens in every element of life. I don't have anywhere near the amount of time it would take to unpack this, but if we took every significant component of human existence, where we live and how we live and whether or not there are discriminatory practices in determining that, the wealth we accrue versus our income, two very different indicators, vast structural differences. Just recently, the average wealth-based assets for white Americans, $134,000 a year. For Latinos and blacks, under $10,000. Okay, so you're looking at a wealth gap that's staggering. Income gaps are dramatic. Educational gaps determined largely by housing property values, which are also discriminatorily applied, significant and relentless in intergenerational effect. Job discrimination, an incredible study called Race at Work by a couple of Princeton sociologists dictate the most staggering levels of job-based discrimination that's fascinating. One of the most amazing results, I'll just give you 1 minute of it, is that a white male job applicant with a criminal record, a felony record, has a better chance of a second callback than a black young person with a college degree and no felony record. I couldn't make this research up. It would, just glad someone else did it. But that's staggeringly important. That means, imagine you're a black person with a felony record, which in this era of mass incarceration, your odds are extremely high. Now you're looking at job discrimination as a lifetime condition. And I'm not mentioning police brutality. I'm not mentioning police profiling or stop and frisk. I'm not talking about longer sentences for smaller crimes or for drugs that people of color use, getting 10 times the sentences the drugs that white people use, even though they're all produce similar highs. No, this is not, I often tell my students in my lecture classes that if I were to bring search dogs and drug-sniffing search dogs to my predominantly white classes at whatever school I've been teaching at, whatever year it is, half of the class would go to jail. And they look at me very frightened because they think, maybe she's going to bring some dogs in here. And what will we do? And so part of it is the policing of an entire community that generates these outcomes, which is enabled by physical structural racism through housing segregation, which is forced both by white flight and poverty and by redlining and by subprime lending. And you create a web of institutional structural forces that create suffocation, rage, despair, and impossibility in an era in which race, in fact, doesn't seem to exist. That is the context for Ferguson. Now, the second context for Ferguson that's crucial is the illiteracy about this gap. The illiteracy about this gap is not a casual oversight. It is intentionally produced. And it's produced so that we can't focus on it because it is and will be a very substantial change if we were to do so. And so the illiteracy that we continually generate by focusing in on, did Michael Brown steal a cigar? Was this cop a racist before? You know, whatever the, you know, shenanigans are about refusing to look at the big picture over and over and over again, and not adding up the number of young people who've been shot down and killed or beaten to death for a variety of reasons that are unjustified in the end. To not string those together and ask the big picture retains a level of illiteracy and really foments the kind of rage that young people have. And I want to say in closing very quickly that this is not something that's outside of Brown. People come to Brown from everywhere, and many of us come from communities that face these kinds of conditions. And so you needn't imagine that this is just an intellectual exchange, although it is. But it is also about knowing that our illiteracy has consequences, short-term consequences, mid-range, and long-term. And so if there's anything I want you to take away from my comments and from this teach-in, is that not knowing is not a luxury we can afford any longer. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tricia, and thanks to all the panelists for 5 really terrific presentations. Now we want to hear from you. We'd like to hear, you know, if you have questions, comments, you want further reflections from the panelists. There are 2 microphones in the 2 aisles, if you can just sort of line up, and when you ask your question, please brief, identify yourself. So any questions or comments?
Someone has to go.
Well, we got a lot of people. Here we go. Just give them a minute, Jim.
Yeah.
Someone else will have to move this back up. Can you guys hear me all?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're great. You're good.
Okay, I'm Rebecca Martin. I'm from the Political Science Department. I had a question about change and continuity. Many of you mentioned how continuous some of these themes are. And for as much as we see Ferguson as something new and alarming and something perhaps that we've never seen before, that, you know, in reality it's kind of like you guys said, a tipping point or a flashpoint in a long process of things that have been happening for quite a few years. So my question to all of you is, how likely or not likely do you see Ferguson? What is Ferguson's potential for becoming an analogy for real change? Now, obviously, local police departments everywhere are now scurrying to make sure that they're not the next Ferguson. They're all going to paint their Humvees black so that they don't look like they're in military garb anymore. Things like that I expect. But as far as real change and how perhaps civilians look at the authority of the state and what is actually allowed and what's not allowed, and like some of you mentioned, the literacy of what rights are, how far can authority go? So I'm just curious to know, for as much as we think that Ferguson is something brand new, can it actually precipitate change?
Great, thanks. Who wants to take that?
I would say that I'm hopeful, and I hate this type of like, because technology is perfect, it does all these things, but I do think that there's something different about the quality of organizing. And I personally think that what makes Ferguson special is the incredible role of scholars in helping with that literacy gap, right? So the generation of people who were trained to understand these connections now have a vehicle either through social media or they're now the expert talking heads. I think that they've helped this process. I think that Jelani Cobb in The New Yorker does a good job of doing this very thing for a larger audience. And so I think that there is a way that there is a new language of critique around Ferguson, and there's a new sensibility that we're seeing coming out in the discursive process that I think will shape how this plays out.
Anyone else?
I'll just say protest works, anger works. That you've heard just brilliant descriptions of the kind of mask, the kind of we don't want to know, the kind of this is really exceptional. And when people get angry and take to the streets, they're ripping that away and saying, no, you have to confront it. And the longer they face up and say you've got to confront it, the more they make change possible. But it's hard. We've been at this for 300 years. So it has to continue. The confrontation just has to continue to make change possible. And it is, you know, we've been at this a very long time. But boy, things change when people say no. And maybe this is the beginning of something like that. Okay, how about over there?
Hi. My name is Sage Green. I'm in the Urban Studies Department, an undergrad.
Can you just speak a little bit louder or closer to the mic? Thanks.
Just shrink a little. So my question is actually really related to what you were just speaking about, and I think specifically might relate to the hashtag Ferguson syllabus. One of the things that was sort of floating around my media sphere regarding this was an article saying that on Facebook, the algorithms that they use to sort their content made it so that the Ice Bucket Challenge was trending all throughout Ferguson, whereas on Twitter, Ferguson was trending much more than that. And like some of that is because the Ice Bucket Challenge was like visual and people wanted to put that on Facebook more than Twitter, but at the same time, there were people saying that like if you want to pretend Ferguson's not happening, just go on Facebook. So I totally agree that technology makes me feel like this is a different setting, but at the same time, how do we keep that innovation to, is that the thing that will change Facebook to something else? How do we keep up with the protest mentality in a more public sphere, and does technology change that?
People were, I don't know if this is true, but there was a way that the critique of the Ice Bucket Challenge was like, this is like white denial, like playing out in Facebook, that Ferguson's not happening. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but there's something to that. I think what's interesting is that, again, the generative potential of Ferguson, so that people are saying things like, this is why you protect net neutrality. This is why we have to understand the importance of this space. And this also opens some questions about digital divide and how young people of color use Twitter on phones instead of like something on a computer, right? So I think that this is what's so great about this moment, that people who are understanding all of these technologies are saying, wait a second, this played a role, and let me think deeply about that. So I think that there is something to this idea about, and I think that there was something about Twitter thinking about this Facebook model, and part of the critique is, well, can you have an Arab Spring, what's called the Arab Spring, without this functioning in this way? So I think those are really important questions.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jolie, and I'm a sophomore at Brown. I'm very glad that Ferguson brings up very urgent issues about structural racism and an unfair, racially unfair criminal justice system, and also things like an exclusive economic system. But personally, I don't believe it's wise to adopt a black and white view of protests, because it is great that these protests are bring our attention to these often forgotten issues, but undeniably, protests often turn violent and turn into riots and mobs, and looters are mixed with earnest protesters. And so I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. And I saw a clip on one of the news stations, police briefing by Captain Johnson, who's a new police coordinator for Ferguson, who is a black man, by the way, who portrayed the police as just struggling all night to maintain public safety for people and maintain nonviolence and peace in Ferguson. And so my question is, how can we realistically protest to an explosive and angry issue without the militarization of police and them dressing in full armor? Realistically, how can we do that?
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Who wants to take that?
I can say that there's a chief of police, I can't remember what city, it might be Philadelphia, who has said that simply having officers dress in everyday uniforms has a greater impact on how the police officer is able to connect with even a protesting crowd, as opposed to a police officer who in many ways is hiding behind riot gear, who is then no longer able to interact with the crowd. So it's productive for police forces trying to provide public safety to not be dressed up in this, what is believed to be or justified as protective gear. But it's also better for people because, for the people protesting, because it is actually the gear, as he was arguing, that often incites them into acting in more violent ways as a response to what I call deeply superficial aspect of clothing. So maybe one of the ways to keep a protest from becoming a mob riot is to get the police officers to stop showing up like they're showing up to a mob riot before it happens. Yeah. So it goes back to dress.
Yeah. But, I mean, in addition to that, you're raising another piece that I don't want to have overlooked, which is that, you know, that these protest and anger and rage around long-standing discrimination and injury is a volatile process. It's not something that can be done only with, you know, with a complete control over nonviolent strategies or using only nonviolent strategies. Of course, those are ideal. But so you're raising a point about what do we do with looting, what do we do with the rage? And I think that's a very important question, but where I get worried is when that question only gets asked at the point at which people are fighting back against an unjust system. In other words, there's years and years of extraordinary violence that's done that not only goes unmarked, but goes unaddressed as destabilizing. So what's being asked is that people accept an unjust system and that looting becomes the symbol of instability, right? And at that moment, it seems to me it's a sign that things were wrong all along and that people have no longer allowed themselves to be complicit and enablers of that system. So I'm not justifying, but I'm asking us to move the conversation back a couple of stages to then think about the relationship between different kinds of looting and different kinds of violence and not start when the poorest and weakest use the only tool they have, really, to respond.
Great. Next question.
Hello.
Yeah.
My name is Victor Terry. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. I graduated from Jackson State University. My comment more so is similar to hers, but I want to talk about the discussion of taking the view off of the victims and putting it on a commodity. Just like with Hurricane Katrina that happened that devastated New Orleans, Ninth Ward, and the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. The conversation was shifted from, oh my goodness, these people have lost their homes, to there are people looting and taking things. And there's even a clip in a newspaper where you have this white family going into a store and the story is phrased of, oh, they're trying to survive. And you have this black family going into a store and it's, oh, they're stealing, they're looting. And I just don't really feel fair. And I guess my second phrase is, I kind of felt uneasy with the demonization of figures like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers during this whole movement. We're saying, oh, nonviolence, nonviolence. Even when teaching civil rights and black history in school, we stray away from these political figures where without the Black Panthers we wouldn't have school breakfast in our school systems now.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Good. Good statement. Next.
Hi, I'm Carrie Hampton, a visiting student from Tougaloo College in Mississippi, and I am from the bottom of Mississippi, where I did experience Hurricane Katrina, Magnolia, Mississippi. And I noticed that here, and as well as at my school, I hear a lot of change, 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 but let's be realistic. We say change, we've been preaching change, our ancestors have been saying change, but we can't have a change until we be real with ourselves and realize that racism may not be out and spoken, but it's alive in some people, and it's not just in white people. Black people have ways of being racist as well because of the way we look at white people and the way that they look at us. And I feel that racism is a learned behavior and it's not something that you were born with. So my question is, how do I tell my brothers in Mississippi that as black men, they have to watch what they say, how they dress, how they move around police officers for fear that they will be gunned down with weapons that they are not even legally able to purchase in the United States? And how do I tell them that we have these rules of do's and don'ts in this world now, in the United States of America, more so where it's not written, but it's stated kind of much so like it was during Jim Crow days? How do I tell them that you are currently living in the new Jim Crow era? Because it's not stated, but come on, y'all. It's there. It's apparent. And we say change and we say we want different things, but I mean, even if we're dead and gone, we're still gonna probably be waiting on those changes. And I just want to know how do we take it there?
Who would like to take that?
Yeah. Well, you won't be dead. I'll be dead. This is for sure. You know, well, let me just back up and say, and you know, this is going to sound like a shameless plug for education, you know, which is tedious in some ways. But I really think this isn't going to work unless we commit to anti-racist education in the public schools, starting in elementary school. You can't train people on ignorance and sort of blind white privilege and then expect to have a different outcome. This is a battle, because in many states it's considered inflammatory and somehow anti-American to teach Mexican-American culture and history, to teach Asian-American culture, African-American, et cetera, et cetera. It's literally called segregation studies among some political factions. So it is very important the question is to go back to your constituency. It has more to do with what is the context of knowing? What is the data? What's the history? What do people know? And how does that knowing inform how we act? But to your other point about change, look, a lot can change very quickly. It's not 100%. I think it was, there's a really great quote from King where he says basically a 10% creative collective can dramatically transform 100% of a society. So we don't really have to have everyone 100% on board, but you have to have a relatively small number. This inspires me, seeing as I'm only reaching a small number. So I'm just going to stay happy on that point, but thank you.
Thank you. And, you know, the other thing to say is you just have to go back in and continue the fight. Each generation, each American generation, and God knows I can speak for my generation, failed. We tried, we failed. And we then pass it on to you guys. And you go back in there and you fight, and maybe you will
fail,
be the ones.
apparently.
No, no.
I mean, that's where you are going, Jim.
No. I'm going to give you the wish, the hope.
Okay.
That your generation does what my generation couldn't do. But you've just got to get in there. And I'm asking you to do something really, really hard, which is go back there and keep on fighting. But that's all we can do.
Wait, I got to revise that, Jim. I'm sorry. You did not fail. I would not be sitting here if you'd failed. There were no black people in any of the schools. The grounds for the diversity you see is the success of many generations. 100% no, but significant change, yes. Actions that what we call refuse, resist, renegotiate, the effort to change what was changed back, of course. Good change always has to grapple with backlash. But that process, yes, there's success and failure. Just so you did better than you say, okay?
Can I also add
Give him a
the
happy
expression you used? You said new Jim Crow. By any chance, is it because you read Michelle Alexander's book?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, here's a plug for Michelle Alexander's book.
Read that one.
But here's the thing, like just the new language that people use in this, right? So you're talking about mass incarceration. You say new Jim Crow. This means something to people, right? And I think that I know that sometimes there's this like really dumb idea that there's like the real world and then what we do in academia is like so useless. That is like the worst dichotomy ever, because what I'm seeing is I see people on the bus with the new Jim Crow. I see my students with the new Jim Crow. I'm sure every student has read it on this campus because this is Brown, right? And then this informs a new way of talking about things. We don't come here and stay here forever. We go back out, and I think that shift. No one was talking about mass incarceration when I was an undergraduate in any way that was productive or reached a bunch of people. Now, I challenge anyone to not talk about the new Jim Crow because they're like, oh yeah, this is how this system works. That's amazing, and it's a very short period of time.
So, thank you.
We have a question over there.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a senior undergrad biology major, and I'm just wondering, Professor Rose, you said not knowing is a luxury we can't afford any longer. Where can we go to learn besides here, like spaces like this?
What's here, the Brown or this actual
like this
forum?
kind of event, but where should we look to learn?
First, there are many classes in the Brown curriculum. Well, maybe not many. Let me take that back. There are some classes. No, I'm not. It's not a critical. I didn't know I was going to be like, ooh, I'm usually aware when I'm saying that. But no, I mean, there are some. There are not many. Not so many that you could just close your eyes, throw a dart, and have a class, on the topic. But there are enough for you to do. Certainly Africana Studies has many numbers of classes on these types of issues. Ethnic Studies has these, American Studies, Sociology has some. I think we need more. I think we should invite various departments to have more classes that deal with these issues. They shouldn't all be located only in Africana Studies or even predominantly. They should be throughout the curriculum. There can be other types of coursework, but the real issue is that there's a lot of academic and accessible public material on this. And you're more than happy to come to my office hours and I'll just take books off the shelf and you can write the titles down, but you can't leave with them. But other than that, it really is about will. This is about drive and desire, right? Because one book leads to another, leads to another. You need 5 books, you get 50 immediately from those 5. So it isn't really about where to find them as much as it is to be able to sort of put yourself in the right space to do it.
Thanks. Over here. And I think what we're going to do is collect some questions just because of time constraints.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm a sophomore here. And my question has to do with language. I know that a lot of what's going on, it wasn't the majority of this panel, but a lot of what's going on and the reason that Ferguson has become such a divisive issue is the media coverage of it. And is the fact that there is what some would say the liberal media, and then there is the conservative media. You have Fox News saying, look at the looters, and you have MSNBC saying, look at Fox News. And so like, it's not productive. And I mean, our country is more polarized than ever. And these two polarized entities in terms of the news is only going to continue to polarize our country. And if people only exclusively watch Fox News, they're only going to learn what's on Fox News, and that's terrifying. So my question has to do with, as a journalist, as someone who's an aspiring journalist, how do I even begin to reach an audience that doesn't want to listen to me?
Okay, great. We're going to collect a series of questions over here.
Hi, so my question is also
Can you identify yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Andrew. I'm a senior concentrator in urban studies. And my question has to do with how I was hoping you could elaborate on the change in discourse from a middle class community to trying to connect it to the greater narrative of Black urban poverty, which of course has this historic erasure that really only comes into the limelight during moments like the Rodney King riots or moments like that. Yet all of a sudden we're beginning to see instances of suburban oppression, Trayvon Martin, the fact that Ferguson is taking place in a pretty suburban community. And so I was wondering what that implies for America now that it seems that Black oppression is no longer being confined from the perspective of how the media portrays it to Black inner cities.
Great. We're going to take a couple more and then turn back to the panel. Sure.
Hi there, my name is Sahil and I work in the Cognitive Linguistic and Psychological Sciences Department. I was really interested in the points that were raised about fashion and style and how that relates to the situation in Ferguson and similar situations. The argument that the way that police dress can cause some sort of behavioral changes or cause them to act in a certain way is one that I find very interesting, but I'm having trouble sort of putting it in conjunction with other arguments that people make about the way that people who belong in gangs dress, or in cases of sexual assault. There's a lot of times that people make the argument that if someone is dressed a certain way, they're asking for it, or that they're more likely to behave in a particular way. Could you just talk a little bit more about how those different examples might fit together? Just sort of struggling to process it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. And how about you?
My name is Andre. I'm a PhD student in the history department. My question is about Obama, who I think in some ways is kind of the elephant in the room in this debate. On one hand, I think there is a tendency to exaggerate his significance and the significance of his election. On the other hand, I don't think that we can deny its importance. And so I'm thinking, after Trayvon Martin was murdered, Obama said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And I thought, he was clearly moved, but also clearly frustrated at the limitations of his office. So I wonder, thinking historically, what do we make of the fact that the first African-American president is largely incidental to this debate?
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. All right, so we have several questions, lots of issues on the plate. Who wants to try to answer some of them?
I'll answer the one about Ferguson as a Black suburb. To understand Ferguson, you have to really understand the city-county divide of St. Louis, and this has animated a lot of the racialized housing and education policy. But I think that it is important to understand Ferguson as not the city or not the urban core that sociologists used to talk about when they talked about uprisings in the 60s, and to thinking about the increasing amount of poverty in suburban areas that was largely in some parts of the Midwest due to changes in housing voucher and public housing, where people were sent to scattered suburbs where no one wanted them there, but then that's where they were. In places like Washington, D.C., where the gentrification of the city now has pushed more African Americans into the suburbs. And so I think that this is a great thesis project, if you haven't picked one yet, to talk about suburbanization and talk about how when people talk about the Great Recession, they're talking about the use of more social services in the suburbs, but a large part of that conversation is the color of the population that is also victims of the loss of public jobs and the types of middle class jobs that helped elevate African Americans in one period are now being gutted as well, and that we start to see why Ferguson happens and how it happens.
Yeah, the idea of cities as black or poor and suburbs as white or rich, that's gone, that's over. There's more poverty in the suburbs than there are in the cities now. Our population is just split up in so many different ways. So that whole image, that whole set of images is really out of date. The problem is that suburbs don't have the resources that cities do. It's places people escaped to, and now they have a very hard time confronting the problems of poverty, of inequality, but not of policing, as you guys have said so nicely.
What did you
Obama. We have to talk about
and
Barack.
then the clothing style.
I could
and
briefly.
then Tony, did you have an answer to something too? No.
Talk about Obama in a minute.
Okay.
I could briefly address the very good style question. The reason I brought up gangs at the beginning and the way in which gang members dressed, which is part of the performance of being a gang member, often people, members of subcultures, members of gangs, are pointed to and blamed for the way in which they dress as bringing the wrath of law enforcement, or the way in which they dress is indicative of their potentially or actually criminal behavior. So what I'm doing with style is flipping that and saying those who actually have the direct and lawful power, in many cases, of inflicting pain and violence against others, who are representatives of the government, too are adhering to their style and should be judged in terms of their style. So it's using that same issue of style back on those who actually have power. But it is problematic when thinking about style because, as I talked about earlier, victim precipitation is often looked at as someone had it coming because of the way they looked, in reference to homicide and rape and assault, etc. But that could work in both ways. Instead of looking at victim precipitation, we should look at victim participation and the way in which people participate in violence. And it's not just victims, but people who turn otherwise law-abiding crowds into victims because they themselves are adhering to the ways in which they dress, and that be law enforcement. So it's a double standard that I'm using as a double standard.
Nice.
Tony?
Yeah, two things. One, I think that the question of the way people look really relates to what already is in people's heads. In other words, there's not a way in which I just look at somebody and it's a neutral look. That neutral look, that look has a set of histories to it. So when the police look at a young black man or look at, at black people, they have a particular expectation of what this population is going to do. And therefore, I understand this business of dress, but I also think that beyond dress there is a question because of how race operates, how race on the body, how a body is marked in a certain color with a certain visual thing, and how that visual thing triggers, if you wish, a certain set of understandings in people's minds as to how they're supposed to behave, what they're supposed to do. And it's not just the police. It is walking into an elevator as a black man with gray hair and all women clutch their purses, right? Because in their heads immediately, the visual of what I am supposed to be or so on triggers a set of reactions around about them. And that's one of the things that we then has to, I think one has to really be very clear on, is that the question of race is also about a certain kind of visual knowledge. And that visual knowledge then means that people are put in certain categories and are treated in a certain way. The second point I would want to make is about President Obama. I think that one of the things is not in this room in terms of the discussion, as somebody said, but I think that one might want to think about the actual struggles that both Professor Rose and James talk about. Because I think that one of the ways in which those struggles in this country has manifested itself or has worked itself out is around questions of representation. And therefore, what happens is that if you have enough representation, a certain kind of what I call arithmetic of representation, if you have a certain kind of representation, then the problem is solved, right? What I think and I applaud and I obviously welcome, the 2008 election. I think it is of absolutely historic significance in this country, given its history of slavery and so on. But I also think that to feel that somehow representation means fundamental structural changes is to actually miss the way in which structures and societies operate. And that one of the things that is really very good in this country, and Tricia is an expert at it more than I am, is the ways in which struggles and the way in which questions of representation can actually operate in a different way. For example, if I was to say to you that if you know Martin Luther King's speech, the community, where do we go from here, in which he talks about capitalism, militarism, poverty, and connects the dots to questions of race, half of you would probably say no. But if I was to ask you about I have a dream, everybody will know, and it's a postage stamp. Yeah. And the reason for that is that there is a way in which power and hegemony works to take things that are a fundamental challenge to it and reorganize it and reach it and change it and spit it out and make it into something else. And so what we have to be very careful is that there's a way in which we are so, because the visual is important, we become so preoccupied with questions of representation in the narrow sense, and I'm not against it, that we again forget that there are some other things layers that are underneath it. And what is fascinating, I think, if you want, is to think about, is that there is a way in which, in a period, a so-called post-racial period, with a African-American president, that the questions of race and racism are so fundamental to the country that it became silent for a couple of years because everybody said, let us see how it will work out. But then all of a sudden, it begins to open up, and all sorts of questions are beginning to be raised again. And that, to me, means that it's nothing to do with Mr. Obama. It has to do with the fact that what happened, in my view, is that the so-called civil rights struggles got moved and reorganized and readapted and reshaped from this actual strategic things it was talking about into trying to think about into forms of representation. And we became preoccupied with that rather than some of the fundamental underlying causes and understandings that emerge out of that, what some people call the Southern Freedom Movement at the beginning of the late 50s and early 60s. And therefore, what we need to do, if you ask me, is to teach a certain kind of history that does not just focus on integration, that does not just focus on representation, but actually begins to think about what is it that ordinary black folks in this country do, and how does the black population and the black freedom struggle become a touchstone for reorganization of American society.
Okay, thank you. I think you have to take one more each. Yeah.
So we have actually come to the end of our time, but since we started late, I think we can take maybe just very quick last round of questions, and then we'll conclude. So why don't you?
Sure. I'll try to be quick. I just want to say every time I come to this, I hear a well-intentioned white person ask where they can find things. Stop asking where. There's Google, there's the library. You can find out. Please do your own research. You don't always have to go to someone else to find out where to be taught when you can teach yourselves. Also, so my question,
is
how do we
not only have conversations about structural racism, but about institutionalized whiteness and how to deconstruct that, especially at a place like Brown, where it is essential to the workings of this university. How can we deconstruct whiteness as this default, as this superior model, and sort of move into those conversations?
Thank you.
Hi,
Yes.
my name is Maya, I'm a sophomore. Like Justice said, or no, not like Justice said. I wanted to point out how some of the people on the board kept pushing that we continue to fight, that we continue to like push this movement to continue going. But I know that it is not the job of the oppressed to explain their oppression to the oppressor. And I think it's very unfair to hold POC communities, specifically the Black community, to this job. And so I want to understand very tangible ways, in addition to like hashtags and Twitter accounts and Facebook, what are very tangible ways in which we can hold communities that are non-Black to be held accountable for this event?
Okay, thanks. We have time for two last very short questions, and I'm sorry for those of you who we don't have time for.
Hi, my name is Susanna. I'm from the neuroscience department, and my question is actually somewhat similar to the previous one. I wanted to ask something relating to social media specifically. I know there were two campaigns that I'd like to talk about on social media. One of them was the If They Gunned Me Down campaign. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
But, okay, so I'll just
So very
assume
brief,
you know.
please.
Okay, so it's where mostly Black individuals, especially like young people of our age, posted one picture of demonstrating their achievements, looking very professional, and then one in like quote unquote more incriminating clothing, style of dress. And then I was reading some op-eds about these movements and also the Hands Up, Don't Shoot movement. And it was written by...
Do you have a question?
Yeah, my question
All right, so
is
why don't you
coming.
jump to the question?
Okay, well the question is basically how can we respond to this issue taking into account sort of our own race and identity, and how can like white people respond to this issue without ruining the point or misunderstanding or like undermining it somehow?
Okay, thanks. Last
Hi,
question.
my name is Huda. I'm a freshman. I actually have like a series of long questions, but I'm going to keep it short. Basically, I'm Palestinian, and a lot of the things that I noticed is a solidarity between what was happening in Gaza and in Ferguson. And one of the things that I was really concerned about is that people need to understand that the U.S. government does a lot of atrocious crimes overseas, and the military is not. You mentioned a lot the militarization of the police, so let's not forget that all of the military equipment that was used in Ferguson has been used for ages against Palestinians and against people in different countries in the global south. And I want to know how Ferguson, how American people as a whole can realize that what's happening in Ferguson, whether or not the racial issue is solved in the next couple of years or a million of years or 100 of years, how people can relate to what's happening in Ferguson and the international situation that's affected by the U.S. and the militarization of the U.S.
Thank you. Quick
I'm going to
responses.
take the two from over there very quickly. And that is to say that it's really important that we remember that anti-racist consciousness can happen on any racially ascribed body. Anti-racist consciousness is about understanding how whiteness as a political formation normalizes and expands itself and works through levels of invisibility that once revealed are no longer able to function with the same level of comfort. Anyone can participate in the examination of this, and so the answer is to understand the workings of racialized categories across the board and to just make choices about where you want to locate yourself in relationship to them. That answers really kind of both of those two questions, I hope, yeah.
You know, and part of the answer is building the good community, and we all have to be part of that. You're absolutely right that you can't just look at people of color and say, hey, it's your job. It's something we all have to work together on. And if you're a white person here, you have to reach out. You've got a burden, but we all have a burden. And that's what a forum like this is about. It's about building a community where people are working together. I'm really struck at how many different cases, Rodney King, Katrina, Trayvon Martin, they just keep coming, right? And it's a heavy load, it's a heavy plate, it's a lot of stuff. But one last thing to say, and it goes back to something Tricia said when she was calling me out a little while ago, and that is that when change happens in American politics and American history, a bunch of kooks, a bunch of crazies. They push and they push and they push. Abolition of slavery, not going to happen. A civil rights campaign, unlikely. And all of a sudden, they transform the world. Change happens all of a sudden after people have worked for generations, have worked hard to make it happen. So that's our job.
Yeah.
And quickly, about the point of, well-meaning white people looking for resources, there are different forms of literacy. When I was 19 years old, some of the ages some of you are now, and won't even be for another year, I thought UCLA and USC were football teams. That's it. I had no idea what the concept of a college campus was. And it took simply wondering about them to engage in that literacy project. So however somebody has to come into literacy, I think is perfectly appropriate. And by asking the question, where do I look? Well, you're already half the way there, because you're already asking about that literacy. It will now come to you. And you're at the right place to ask where to find resources. There are many ways to find it, and we said many of us offer a class. I teach crime in the city, and it's still shopping period, so see you Thursday morning.
He's only got 150, he needs 50 more. And with that comment, I just want to conclude by saying this process of literacy is going to be taking place over the course of this year. It's not just this one event and this one evening. This is the beginning of a large series of other events that all of us will be collaborating on going forward. There's an event about incarceration rates in the United States later on this month. So I welcome you all to keep on participating in these events, keep the conversation going, keep on asking the questions, and share the information that you have. We've unfortunately come to the end of our time, but please help me thank these wonderful panelists.